Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ENG3E Term 2A, brought to you by WASA Distance Education Center. I'm your instructor, Mike Laverty, broadcasting from our studio in Sioux Lookout, Ontario. Today is Tuesday, March the 7th, 2023. We are on class 17 of ENG3E. That's grade 11 English, workplace English. We are wrapping up our discussion of Unit 3. Today we'll discuss 3 of the unit assignments. So as I mentioned at the start of these Unit 3 classes, that in the previous 2 units you were responsible for the unit assignments. Those are the numbered assignments. And the textbook assignments for the first 2 units. Units 3, 4, and 5 don't have any textbook assignments, so you're just responsible for completing the unit assignments in these courses. And there are 14 of them in Unit 3. So today's class will touch upon those outstanding units, the ones that are remaining. And if we have time, then I'd like to offer an introduction to the culminating assignment. So if we've got some time at the end, then I'd like to at least introduce the culminating activity for this unit. Give you a taste of what's to come there, and then probably delve into that next class like a little bit more in detail. But I think depending on how fast it takes us to get through these unit assignments, we'll see how much time we have left to tackle the culminating activity. So here's some important dates to keep in mind. The WASA office will be closed from Monday, March 13th to Friday, March 17th. So this is, of course, our March break. So during that time, Monday, March 13th to Friday, the March 17th, there will be no classes or broadcasts. During that time, the office will be shut down. I am not sure what the situation is like in the learning centers. You might have to check with them to see if they'll be open during the March break. You may see some closures there as well, but I hope that everybody has a great March break and they enjoy themselves, whether they're working or not. If you've got some time off, that'd be great. I know I'm looking forward to having some time off with and spending it with my family. I'm very much looking forward to that. So I'd just like to give a brief recap of where we are with this course. So we have units 1 and 2 wrapped up completely. So excited about that. And in the next couple of classes, we'll have unit 3 wrapped up. And then we will jump into units 4 and 5. And then we're going to spend some time going over the final exam. And yeah, during this final week, we'll talk about, that's week number 9 of the course. We will do some final exam prep, but we will also do a course review. We'll have a look at some key ideas from the course. I'll maybe go back through my notes and see if there's anything that I felt that we rushed through. As I mentioned, it's my first time teaching this course. And there's a lot of stuff to go through, so it's sometimes hard to balance things out, especially if you've never done this before. But I am becoming more familiar with the content material, seeing how long it takes to teach certain things. So trying to strike a balance between covering all the material in the units equally, and then we'll talk about that final exam, and then I of course won't have the actual final exam up on my screen or open for discussion, But what I will do is I will prepare a mock exam. So an exam that looks very much like the one that you'll take in terms of format and the types of questions. The content will be different. And it'll test primarily your reading and your writing skills. So your ability to read a text, size it up, analyze it, and respond to questions about that text, and your ability to generate your own text, your own writing. So if you're listening live, that's awesome. Thanks for tuning in to 91.9 FM. You can also listen to us on Bell ExpressVu channel 972. Please note you can phone into the studio at 1-807-737-4017 or 1-800-465-7144, and you can ask a question, you can join in on the discussion, make a comment, whatever the case may be. You can go to zoom.us, or if you have Zoom already installed on your machine, just open up the Zoom platform, and then you will find a join button at the top of the screen. And then once you hit that join button, the Zoom software will prompt you for a meeting ID, and that meeting ID is 417-6699799. So those are the ways you can participate in the class live. If you can't participate in the class live, and I understand that, many people are trying to get that work-life balance. And, you have kids, you have jobs, you've got other obligations. If you search for Laverty Wasa, that's my last name, Laverty space WAHSA. Search for me, you'll find my YouTube channel, and you'll find some playlists. And you will find ENG3E playlists. And you'll also find ENG4E, and you'll find OLC40. So that's the grade 12 literacy chorus and the grade 12 workplace college English. So our workplace level English. So if you're looking for help on any of those three courses, OLC40's got a full term up there, and I'm teaching ENG4E and ENG3E for the first time, so I'm building up those playlists as well. Just want to, give a shout out to, or just acknowledge that if you need any help with submitting your work, please reach out to your DEC or talk to myself. It's been a few classes since I've reminded you of this, so it's important to do it now. There are many ways you can submit work. You can, if you've got access, you can physically mail your work from the learning centers. You can scan pages. You can, take photos of them and send them through Messenger or email. As long as your assignments are legible and your instructor can easily make out what you're trying to say, then we have many options. You can fax pages. That's a toll-free fax at 1-800-463-7852. Just a note to please submit your work into groups of 5 to 10 assignments. This allows me to provide you with feedback quickly and to guide your future work. So that's really important, and the relationship you have with your instructor, I know, just speaking from myself, my personal teaching practice, so I love to read student work. I love to read your stories. I genuinely enjoy just reading student work, and I like to give feedback. And that is arguably where you're probably going to learn the most, and that's probably going to change your skills the most, is having someone read your work and having someone feedback and give some feedback on it. So it is a really important part of the process. And when you do submit your assignments, please include your name, community, course code, and assignment information. Reach out to me at mlaverty@nnecschools.org, or find me on Facebook. I'm at Laverty Wasa, same as my YouTube. You can add me as a friend or just simply communicate with me on Messenger. Please phone the Wasa office at 1-807-737-1488. I'm at extension 2211. Or phone our long-distance number at 1-800-667-3703. we're here. We're waiting for your phone calls. There's a dedicated team here that's more than willing to go the distance to help you graduate. So please reach out to us. Here's your 4-week suggested progress. You should have made contact with your teacher, that's me, through email, messenger, or phone. Read the study guide, Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3. Completed all assignments from Unit 1 and completed most assignments from Unit 2. So that's the suggested progress. So if you've invested 4 weeks in the course, that's about how far you should have come at this point. All right, so on to today's lesson. So we'll talk about the words of the day. On our second day of the week, I like to do words of the day. We will talk about assignments for Unit 3, that's 12, 13, and 14. And we'll talk about the assigned reading from the road ahead. That's Don't Give Up on the Media, which is another newspaper article. Yesterday's class, we looked at a newspaper article that was a complaint about a somewhat controversial jeans advertisement. So your learning goals are to take notes on the Unit 2 assignments, 12, 13, and 14, do a close reading of a newspaper article, and continue to discuss the media. So we're going to talk about depictions of violence in the media, different sources, and I think I was going to type in an etc. there. Okay. And your success criteria will be to use your understanding of the media, particularly newspaper articles, and your reflections on this subject to complete unit assignments 12, 13, and 14. So again, we're talking about Unit 3 of ENG3E. Just let me pull this up from my pile of notes here. So we are on Unit 3, which is the journey. And, many of these assignments are, towards the end of the unit assignments, are about newspaper articles and discussions on the media in general. And like I mentioned, if we have time, then I will jump into the culminating activity and sort of give you some background information on that. Before we do that, we'll talk about our words of the day. So I've got Anishinaabe-Moan words up on the board. Again, I don't speak the language, but I'm trying to learn words in the language and try to infuse it into my lessons. So we have a verb, which is baba majimo, which is a verb which means she or he spreads the news about. So we see we got that root word baba majimo, and then we've taken that word and it's a compound word. So when we combine that with mazinegan, which is a book, a letter, a document, a paper, so it can mean a multiple of things, but usually like some kind of a text or a document, a book, a letter. And so Baba Majimo Mazinaigan is a newspaper, right? So when you take those two words and you combine them, you get this compound word in the middle, right? So Anishinaabe-Moan, Ojibwe, like a lot of languages across the world, has that pattern where, parts of words, like prefixes and suffixes, are combined in different orders to make new words, and sometimes two words just get kind of shoved together to make a word. A couple of related English words up on the screen, and for today are correspondence. So correspondence is a noun. This is communication by an exchange of letters. Another meaning is the news, commentary, letters, etc. received from a newspaper or magazine. So sometimes we refer to a journalist is someone who writes for publication, writes for a newspaper, writes for magazines, does investigative reporting, that kind of thing. And a correspondent is usually someone who's sent out to, report on a location in the world, and then they send their correspondence to their newspaper, right? Or whatever company they work for. So correspondence is communication by letters, and it also more specifically refers to when you work in the journalism field. To be a correspondent is to send correspondence to your publication. Communication is the imparting or exchange of thoughts, opinions, or information by speech, writing, or signs. And that's what this course is all about. It's the imparting of exchange or thoughts. And throughout this course, you are examining the thoughts, the opinions, and the information of other people, right? So when you read, you are absorbing the information of other people. But of course, as we've talked about at length in this course, you're not just you're not just a robot who just sucks up information and just accepts it and reads it with no questions asked. Hopefully, with the benefit of this course, you are you're developing those critical thinking skills, and you are looking at the thoughts of others, but also putting it in context and thinking about, okay, who is delivering the message, what's their purpose, what are they trying to get out of it, and that can kind of like seem kind of like cynical or like negative at times, because you're always like judging people and wondering where they're coming from and what's their motivation and what are they trying to get out of this. But I would argue that it's a very healthy attitude to take. But basically, you're trying to put yourself in their shoes, and you're trying to envision what they want and trying to figure out what they're trying to get out of communicating this message. And then on the other side of that, when it's your turn, when you're the writer and when you're the one putting out information into the world, then you're thinking about your audience, right? So it's about communicating your ideas and getting your thoughts out into the world and having a voice, and all of that is really important. But it's also important to think about your audience and to think about how they're going to receive your message. And are they ready to receive your message? And what's the best way to get your message out there, Are you talking to the right people? Maybe you need to talk to other people. Maybe you need to broaden who you're sending your message out to. Right? So these are really important questions that we need to ask ourselves, and we need to think about, especially in the workplace. Workplace communication is a very special form of communication, and there's these kind of questions are very applicable. Who's my audience? Who am I appealing to? What do they want? What do they need to hear? What do they want to hear? All right, so we are going to delve into our assigned reading from today, which is found in our anthology, The Road Ahead. And as I've mentioned to you a few times, I often think that it's beneficial to read the questions ahead of time, and to sort of prime yourself and to get your mind ready to discuss, well, not discuss, but to read the material, and to sort of prime yourself and to get yourself ready, get yourself in the right framework, and just have some questions at the back of your mind. And if you flip to page 122 in our anthology, this is Don't Give Up on the Media by Susan Rutten, you'll find an example of a newspaper article, And this is similar to the ones that we were talking about yesterday, like an editorial or a letter to the editor where someone has a complaint about something or they have an issue they want to bring up, and that issue may be controversial. People may have different opinions on it. And that's what makes for the most, interesting and engaging writing. Often, not always, but I mean, like writing that is touching on controversy or things that impact your day-to-day life, and I think that the media is such an important thing to talk about and to think about, and it's always changing, and it's changed quite a bit since I was a kid, and that's important to keep in mind as we discuss these articles. So this textbook was published over 20 years ago, and so the discussion on the media has certainly changed a lot in 20 years, especially with the introduction of smartphones and social media, and just technology just becoming everywhere. It's omnipresent. That's a word you hear all the time. It's just everywhere, and so that needs to be discussed. But I think that the core discussion sort of remains the same. So I want to walk through some of these discussion questions. So this is the before you read section at the top of the page. So you're not expected to answer these questions, but they do sort of set the stage. So these are questions you can ask yourself. So what source, if any, do you use to get your news? So myself, primarily, I listen to a lot of CBC radio, so like the Thunder Bay office. So I do listen to that every morning on my phone. So I have the CBC app on my phone. So it's traditional radio, but I get the broadcast on my phone. So I get a lot of my news through there. But of course, I've also got a Facebook feed, and so I add pages that I like, and I get information from them. What type of news stories get your attention? So that's a really important question to ask yourself. Like, what are you drawn to? What news stories, if any, get your attention, that engage you? What do you care about when you hear things on the news? I mean, I love to hear local and regional news. I like to hear what's happening to my municipality, to other municipalities in my region, what's happening in the north with First Nations communities. I love to hear about that, so that's kind of why I like CBC. But I also like to listen to a lot of American radio. I, like a lot of Canadians, kind of had this dark obsession with Donald Trump and seeing what's happening with that country, so that's certainly what I like to listen to. That gets my attention. I love sports news. What are the pros and cons of watching the news on television? So that kind of gets to changes in media. Television is sort of fixed, and you have to watch it at a certain time, and you're only getting one person's opinion. Same thing with radio. It has the limitations of only having it at a set broadcast time. But I guess things are changing now where news companies are putting their stuff on YouTube, and you can watch the news or listen to it on an app anytime you want. But there are pros and cons in terms of availability of reading the news in print. So print is hard, especially if you live in a remote community, getting things mailed to you, that kind of thing. I love the Globe and Mail, but I have to read it online. I wouldn't mind reading it in print, but it's really hard to get it in Sula Couch, or you got to pay a bunch of extra money. What are the pros and cons of reading the news online or on social media, right? Social media is great because you can sort of pick and choose the sources that you want to get news from. But of course, there's a problem there when you only get the news that you want to hear and you don't hear a balanced perspective, right? So yeah, I think we're all busy, we all have lots going on, but best case scenario, you're probably getting your news from a variety of sources. And people make mistakes, and organizations and journalists, they have bias, and they have their mission and they have their views on things. And I think that's just an important part of being, a human being, is you recognize that other humans will make mistakes and they'll have their faults and no one's perfect. And and really one of the few tools we have at our disposal is to get our news from a variety of sources, right? Getting our stories from many people from many different perspectives. And if it's something that we truly care about and it's important to our lives and it's important to our families and our communities, then I think we can take the time to get it from at least a few different sources, right? But just this is good to sort of prime ourselves before we read the article. So, question 12 from Unit 3 reads: In the newspaper editorial, Don't Give Up on the Media, you will read the line which states that the crime rate is declining in Canada as well, while Canadians think crime is getting out of control. Why do you think the writer mentions this? At least two sentences. All right, so let's when I read this out, let's keep an eye out for that particular phrase. Quote: The crime rate is declining in Canada as well, while Canadians think crime is getting out of control. Keeping in mind this was written over 20 years ago, so it's not referring to the crime rate today. It's referring to the crime rate of like the late 90s, early 2000s. Question 13. Many people say that there is too much violence on TV. What is your opinion, your thoughts, your feelings on this topic? In your response, comment on whether or not violence affects you or others, especially children and young adults, in any way. One paragraph containing at least 6 sentences. And question 14. Write a brief summary of Don't Give Up on the Media. One paragraph containing at least 7 sentences. Note the rubric found on page 9. So we'll talk a little bit about the rubric, what I'll be using to evaluate your submissions. So we'll take a closer look at that. But let's read the article together and have a discussion on it. So, Don't Give Up on the Media by Susan Rutten. Yet another friend tells me she's giving up on news. Too depressing, she says. She now listens to a music station on her way into work rather than CBC radio. So we've got a first-person perspective, so that's important, right? So we're talking about the narration. We've got a first person, and the first person is going to have pronouns like me and my, and I'm not sure if she uses the I voice in here. Oh yeah, she does. Yeah. I or I'm. So we're getting a story told from this journalist perspective, right? This woman named Susan Rutten. We're getting her perspective. All right, so she mentioned that her friend now listens to the music station on her way into work rather than CBC radio. Since she's in a news withdrawal, she probably didn't hear about the new American study showing that in a 3-year period, while the U.S. murder rate dropped by 20%, the number of murder and crime stories aired on TV stations went up by 721%. Those 3 years were 1993 to 1996, so obviously O.J. Simpson had a lot to do with that stat. Nonetheless, it's a startling figure. So, if you're not familiar, O.J. Simpson had probably, which was one of the most famous trials of all time. Parts of it were televised. Late-night comedians were constantly making jokes about it. This is when I was in high school, and so they're just making that connection. Nothing quite that dramatic happened in Canada, I'm sure. Or am I? How many Paul Bernardo stories were aired on Canadian TV newscasts? Countless. Did Paul Bernardo rate the massive? Did he rate the massive national TV coverage he got? No. The crime rate is declining in Canada as well, while Canadians think crime is getting out of control. So we're talking about this difference between what's being reported in the media what's true and what people think is true, and how the media might influence their thinking. One night last week, NBC led its national newscast with a story about John Bennett Ramsey, the murdered Colorado girl. That illustrates how tabloid values have corrupted American TV news as news directors try to compete with the infotainment shows. That American trash affects us too, through cable channels and news feed to Canadian networks. The OJ trial showed news directors that a nation could be gripped for months by one murder. So the exploitative news formula gets applied to every offbeat murder. The murdered child beauty queen, the murdered fashion designer, or whomever. That desperate search for ratings has been matched by major cuts in budgets of TV newsrooms in recent years, both locally and in the big networks. There are fewer foreign correspondents and fewer reporters to do big time-consuming stories. Crime stories are cheap and an easy way to fill a newscast. So we're getting into an interesting discussion here where, the news, where, they may say that it's all about information and educating the population, and I think that's what journalism is supposed to be about in its finest form, or what it aspires to do. But at the end of the day, it is a business, and anytime something is a business, then it has to make money, it has to have viewers, and that is inevitably going to impact how the information is given. And so it's not just the kinds of information that media sources give us, it's what they're not giving us, what they focus on, what they ignore, right? There's a subheading in the article. It reads decline in standards, and then it follows from there. I'm not letting newspapers off the hook here. Newspapers have had the same influences and to an extent the same effect. The decline in standards, however, hasn't been nearly as great as in TV and radio. In defense of news editors, they've had a lot to deal with in recent years. For starters, the world is basically at peace, so there's a global news shortage. What can fill the gap? Complex examinations of political and social problems take time, cost money, and don't interest many readers or viewers. It's much easier to fill the news gaps with stories about Clifford Olson or women going topless. Clifford Olson is a infamous Canadian serial killer who died over 10 years ago, but when this textbook was written, was talked about a lot. News editors are also grappling with a gender complexity unknown in the past. The people I know who are switching off the news are women. They find all the stories of child abuse and murdered wives too upsetting. There was a time when the news had an acknowledged gender divide. The women's page section. Happy features, advice columns, food and fashion were for women. The rest of the paper was for men. So I can't really comment on this too much. I don't really know the history of newspapers that well to comment on it. I would provide a word of caution for when someone bases their arguments on anecdotal evidence. So anecdotal means stories you've heard. So a buddy of mine says this, and everybody I've talked to says this, right? And so that may or may not be true, but I mean, it's hard to take your limited experience and then generalize for everybody. Women feel this way because the women I know say this, right? It's a bit of a dangerous argument, and you should always watch out for it when a writer uses that kind of argumentation. They may be right, but they might be wrong. Newspapers and TV and radio are now trying to create a news package that appeals to women and men, both. The fact that many women are turning away from news tells me that journalists haven't got the package right just yet. The tuning out of public affairs, which is what news is, worries me. Because mixed with the junk, be it Princess Di's love or Clifford Colson's courtroom stunt, are real news issues that we must know and care about. When an Edmonton woman gets set on fire, citizens of Edmonton have to know about that. It's not just a horror story. It has something to tell us about how our society is functioning, or malfunctioning. Or take the situation on the Stony River near Banff. That reserve has been an ongoing tragedy and outrage for years, but until a judge spoke about the violence and the corruption, the situation rarely made the news. The Stonies are a hard cop story to cover. Band members are afraid to speak for fear of reprisals, but if the Stony mess isn't made known, that tragic situation will fester and we will all be responsible for having ignored it. However tempting it is to do so, we can't turn our back on the news. To do so is to turn our back on society and our obligation to our fellow citizens, on our duty as voters who must choose the next government. Citizens should demand better quality news coverage from their newspapers, TV, and radio stations. They should also develop their own ability to sift wheat from chaff, to realize that the Stoney situation is a real concern, while Olson's court appearance is not. Sifting is easier with newspapers than it is with a TV or radio newscast. With a newspaper, you can skip the junk and read the important stuff. The important thing is to keep plugged in, not every minute, but enough to know what's going on. No man is an island, as John Donne said, and no woman is either. So I think there's a really important point here that the author brings up in that last paragraph, second last paragraph. Sifting is easier with newspaper than it is with a TV or a radio newscast. With a newspaper, you can just skip the junk and read the important stuff. So I think if we're thinking about the media in 2023, then we certainly have that luxury where we can find out and we can choose the news sources that matter to us, that we find to be important. But the author also brings up entertainment versus education, and I think people, I think just breaking down human psychology, I just think that maybe we want to be entertained more than we want to be educated, or maybe it's being entertained is certainly a lot easier. And depending on what you have going on in your life, the ability to care about the news and to be invested in the news is a luxury, right? If you're struggling and you don't have a lot of resources, or you lack the literacy skills, right? And a lot of people do lack the literacy skills, and they have to rely upon someone else to give the news to them. That's an issue too, right? Who has access to the information? Who are the ones writing the information? Who's got control of the story? Another interesting point we could talk about is this mention of the Stoney Reserve, which is near Banff. So, issues that matter to Indigenous people, like in Ontario, across Canada. It's not like they weren't featured in the media, but especially in the past, say 15 years or so, you've seen much more focus on Indigenous issues in the media, and bringing attention to it. And you're also seeing, like Indigenous run media companies and people trying to get in control of the story, right? And because, a lot of this stuff, it does come down to storytelling. And this article, Don't Give Up on the Media, it's one woman's opinion. It's her view. She's telling a story about the state of the media back when the article was published. But that's really what we're all doing. We're all telling our stories, and there are competing stories that get out there. And, the stories that win are the ones that last and are the ones that get told. And they may not necessarily be the right stories, and they may not necessarily be the truth. And I think that's another important angle to think about, and another important question to answer. Like, is there an objective truth out there to be found? I don't think that any news network or any journalist or any source of media is 100% neutral and is just sharing information, right? We all have motivations, we all have wants and desires, and so that's really important, right? So and that's what it means to be a critical thinker, and to be critical of the media, and just to ask questions about something, and ask where it's coming from. Where did this information come from? A really great example would be, that you could talk about, if you're talking about the media in general, is, the COVID-19 pandemic. So the COVID-19 pandemic, how that played out in the media was just, completely fascinating to see how Like the messaging coming from public health officials, versus the anger and frustrations that people had with lockdowns and people not trusting information anymore and not trusting government, having a hard time trusting authority, questioning their motivation, right? The that you can find tons of stuff like that written online, and I think that kind of gets to the point of and then there was lots of discussions about where do you get your information from? Do you only get it from one source? Do you get it from multiple sources? Are you challenging um, the information you get? Do you ask questions about it? It's people are like getting very divided and putting themselves on this side versus that side and calling the people on the other side sheep because they just follow along blindly, where we're the critical and informed ones. And so all those things are kind of playing out now, and they've been playing out for the past couple of years. So we'll go back and we'll have a look at those questions for the last what do we got here? Just a little bit of almost about 10 minutes left here. So that line, the crime rate is declining in Canada as well, while Canadians think crime is getting out of control. So remember in the article she mentions the American crime rate, but then also notices the similar phenomenon in Canada, where she says that the crime rate's declining, but Canadians think it's getting out of control. Now, one of the first questions I raised when I read that sentence was, where is she getting that information from? There's no citations here, and where would you get that kind of information from? And so if we pull up our Google search, and if we just type in, let's say, let's do crime rates in Canada. We've got Stats Canada has crime, justice, and community safety statistics, so that's nice to see. Let's see. Victimization. So you can see a 3% increase in the homicide rate per 100,000 people. So it's going to be it's going to be a lot of information to sift through. I was just hoping to pick something here, right? Okay, so it looks like Canada's murder rate was an attempted homicide and was very high in the 70s and the 80s compared to what it is now. It's certainly gone down. Given Canada's ever-expanding population, however, the year 2021 yielded the largest raw number of murders in the country's history. Even amid spasms of violence throughout the 90s and 70s and 80s, the total annual number of Canadian murder victims rarely peaked above 700. Wow, so our homicide rate is roughly twice that of the UK or France and quadruple, so 4 times that of Italy. Okay. But compared to the global average, we are a lot lower than most other countries, right? So crime rate is a very broad way to calculate something. There's lots of crime. There's like domestic crime. There's everything from just robberies to homicides to like embezzling, and there's violent crime, and right. So it's hard to kind of break it apart. But again, and in terms of figuring out why Canadians think crime is getting out of control, it is kind of like a blanket statement, right? Um, because nobody asked me what my thoughts were about crime getting out of control. So they must have done some kind of a survey. They must have got the information from it somehow. But just again, like you can just it's not really an open-ended question. It's asking a specific question. It's saying, why do you think the writer mentions this? But again, when you get a question like why speaks to purpose. You know, what what do they want? What do they want the audience to think? To think or to feel? How does it fit in, with their, I guess, their main idea or their opinion, right? So that's some important questions you can ask yourself here. Okay, many people say that there is too much violence on TV. What is your opinion, thoughts, feelings on this topic? In your response, comment on whether or not violence affects you or others, especially children and young adults in any way. One paragraph containing at least 6 sentences. So there's too much violence on TV. All right, so for this one, this is assignment 13. We have violence on TV. And what you're going to do here is do a bit of pre-planning, right? So I would do a sentence planner. So your first sentence will be, you're going to state your opinion. So you will state your opinion. So you'll agree or disagree. And then let's see, what do we got here? Okay, at least 6 sentences. Well, we'll get the first ones planned out. So here's sentence number 2. Now I would find discuss a specific example. You could talk about a TV show or several examples. And that's gonna back up your opinion. And then what I would do is 3, 4, and 5, and then 6 would be our closing one. That's gonna be you'll restate. You're going to restate your opinion. And then 3, 4, and 5, you are going to have many, even more specific examples. And how they impact an audience. You know, and I would recommend you choose a specific audience too, right? If you can. So seniors, children, teenagers, preteens, students, that kind of thing, right? So that's what I would suggest doing. So state your opinion. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Discuss a specific example. Give many more specific examples, how they impact your audience, and then finally restate your opinion. And that last one is to write a brief summary of Don't Give Up on the Media. One paragraph containing at least 7 sentences. Now that rubric we discussed, so you have to demonstrate through knowledge of form. So that's just writing in a paragraph form. Demonstrate your understanding and knowledge through using information, ideas, concepts, and themes. Thinking inquiry is using critical and creative thinking skills with a high degree of effectiveness. So that's just, being critical of your source, being creative, bringing lots to the table. Communication communicates information and ideas with a high degree of clarity and confidence. Communicates with a strong sense of audience and purpose. Demonstrates extensive command of the form. Application uses the required language conventions accurately and effectively all or almost all of the time, and uses the writing process with a high degree of competence. So we'll spend a few minutes on this before we wrap up, but assignment 14, that's a summary. So I would focus on the form. Define. And you can refer back to our previous lessons on summaries, okay? So define the type of writing, where it was published, where and why it was published. You will talk about the content. This is the main idea, the examples used, and the author's opinion. So you talk about the form of the article, the content, the main examples used, the author's opinion. You can talk about the style, the word choice, and you could talk about the effectiveness of the article. You could also talk about when it was published. So you put it in context. When was it published? Why was it published? Who published it? What's the main idea? What examples do they use to enforce that main idea? What is the author's opinion? What's their style? What's their word choice? You can quote the text to do this, right? You can talk about, kind of running out of room here, but we could talk about the organization. How long is it? How the length of it, the paragraphs. So these are all things to keep in mind when you write a summary, and you've written a few summaries in this class already, so I would refer back to our previous discussions on summaries. So that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for tuning in. We will see you for tomorrow's class, number 18.